Hello, thank you for attending this presentation today. My name is Kenzie MacNeil and I'm a student at St. Francis Xavier University, working with Dr. Norine Verberg as a MyTax intern. On behalf of both of us, I'll be presenting on the educational transitions of refugees resettling in rural Nova Scotia. And I would like to just acknowledge that I am presenting this from St. FX, which is located in Mi'kma'ki, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. To provide some context, during Operation Syria, which was Canada's response to the humanitarian crisis happening in Syria, Canada welcomed over 25,000 Syrian refugees by the end of February 2016 and many more since then. This operation led to a significant uptake in rural resettlement, with 17% of blended visa office-referred families being resettled in Nova Scotia. The BVOR program makes it easier for private groups to sponsor highly vulnerable refugees. Given this uptake in rural resettlement and Nova Scotia's specific contributions, a qualitative study explores what works when newcomers are resettled by community and faith groups in rural Nova Scotia. Using theoretical and snowball sampling and the long interview method, this study learns from volunteers and newcomers about the economic transitions of rural resettled refugee newcomers. As education is deeply connected to economic transitions, we are also exploring the educational transitions of refugee youth and adults, which, as indicated, is the focus of this presentation. Education transitions can mean youth attending high school in Canada and preparing for post-secondary options, young adults achieving college or university goals, and adults with previous certificates and degrees attending post-secondary schooling to recertify. To provide some background on the resettlement processes in Canada, the majority of refugee resettlement in Canada is government-sponsored, where refugees are resettled in medium to large cities by settlement service agencies. All rural resettlement is done through a program called the Private Sponsorship of Refugee Program. This allows community groups to raise funds and financially support newcomers for a minimum of 1 year. All resettlement in rural areas is done by community and faith groups, and the refugee resettles in the area the sponsorship group lives. Sponsorship groups can either identify and name who they will sponsor, or use the Blended Visa Office Referral BVOR program to sponsor refugees identified as highly vulnerable. When resettled, the newcomers who arrive are no longer considered refugees, but I will use this term refugee newcomer to distinguish between other pathways of immigrating to Canada. It is worth noting here that a recent longitudinal multivariate study shows support for past research that there is an advantage for those resettled by community sponsors in the short term, but mixed results in the long term. The community sponsorship advantage is more pronounced for less educated refugees. However, it diminishes quickly for more educated refugees. Those with no educational background make more rapid and durable economic transitions when sponsored and resettled by community groups. Our study sample includes interviews with newcomers and volunteers from 11 sponsorship groups in 6 rural areas. The 11 groups we sampled collectively resettled 46+ families who came through the BVOR stream and assisted with 3 government-sponsored families who migrated to rural areas following resettlement. The coloration on this map reveals the degree of rurality to make the point that the population density where newcomers are resettled is quite small. Some of the questions we have been exploring around what works for rural resettlement include: is this a welcoming place for newcomers? What resources are available to them? Are there adequate educational and employment opportunities? Is this a place where newcomers can move and transition within? Due to the methodology, we can only speak generally to how newcomers fared in their education endeavors. However, most youth and young adults we have spoke with have been able to continue their secondary schooling and are working on achieving post-secondary goals, whereas adults with dependents find it more challenging to attend post-secondary schooling. It is important to note that refugee newcomers coming to Nova Scotia arrive as a diverse population with various human capital skills and refugee circumstances. Factors such as the length of time spent in a refugee camp or country of first asylum, disruptions in schooling, and access to bring in credentials, as well as getting those certifications recognized in Canada, will contribute to newcomers' post-migration experience. To provide a little context on the importance of newcomers receiving post-secondary training in Canada, Research indicates that Canadian post-secondary training contributes to higher employment rates and earnings. According to a government study, 8 years after landing, government and community-sponsored newcomers who participated in post-secondary training were 30% and 25% more likely to be employed than those without, and that the average 8th-year earning of refugees are $9,000 higher among those with Canadian post-secondary education. However, the data also indicates that refugees participated in post-secondary training at a lower rate than other categories of immigrants, with only 22% of male and 17% of female government-sponsored refugees having participated in post-secondary training. While the diverse backgrounds and transitions to Canada do contribute to whether newcomers enroll in post-secondary training, a question that arises from the data is, does Canada make post-secondary schooling accessible to people from diverse refugee backgrounds? Literature indicates that post-secondary education is highly valued by refugee youth and their parents. However, these youth face a number of barriers in reaching their educational goals. One of the main challenges related to pre-migration for refugee youth is interrupted schooling. Another variable cited is trauma and mental health. However, that is something we were not able to explore within the scope of our project. Other challenges refugee youth face include language barriers, adequate access to information about post-secondary options and the requirements needed for these programs, high school age cap policies, and the financial burden. It is important to note, while there is a body of literature discussing their youth's experiences, much of the literature is focused on larger urban centers and does not distinguish between government-sponsored and community-sponsored refugees. While literature cites getting credentials recognized as a significant barrier to finding employment, and that higher educated newcomers are more likely to experience job unsatisfaction than those with lower levels of education, there is a gap in the literature on refugees attending post-secondary schooling as adults and or going through the process of getting their credentials recognized. Credential recognition is something that has come up with almost all of the newcomers in our study with previous post-secondary education, and from our project we have also learned about several other barriers that adults face during this process, which we will discuss further in our findings section. So now, to begin speaking about the main themes in our study, the following 5 learnings from the study, some of which are split up based on the experiences of newcomer youth compared to adults, include extended timelines, which I will define and explain in the next slide, support educational transitions of newcomer youth, the valuable assistance provided by sponsorship groups and schools with newcomers determining the assistance they need, credential recognition as a barrier faced by most higher educated newcomers having varying experiences with English as an additional language, access and readiness, and that volunteering and employment support EAL learning and educational transitions. For my analysis, I will be using the term extended timeline. This refers to the choices made by newcomer youth to complete secondary and post-secondary programs over a longer period of time in order to achieve their educational goals. For some youth, extending their timeline for completing high school or university helped with overcoming the pre-migration barrier of disrupted schooling and enabled youth to get the courses and grades needed to get into a program of their choice. The Nova Scotia high school age gap policy is set at 21, and for the most part, this gap provided youth with the flexibility they needed to extend their educational timeline. In other provinces, the high school age cap is lower, and this has been a significant barrier to youth who want to go back to high school. Based on the experience of sponsor groups, even youth who have completed high school in their home country should attend at least 1 year of high school in Canada, as it provides youth with experience in the Canadian learning environment and provides them with Canadian credentials, which has been deemed helpful when applying for post-secondary schooling. Sponsorship groups in high schools assisted refugees in their educational transitions by facilitating meetings with the newcomers in the high schools, touring university and college campuses, asking youth and adults about their educational and employment goals, and providing them with the information about the prereqs required for the programs of their choice, as well as helping them apply for student loans. It is important to note that the relationship between the newcomers and the sponsorships is very much a two-way street, with the newcomer determining their own educational goals and asking for help when needed. As one newcomer put it, "So everything was new for me, but I ask a lot. So this is my rule. Don't sit home and just watch. You need to knock on the door and ask people for help." This assistance helped to break down the informational barrier, which, as literature indicates, many newcomers face when trying to navigate the systems and institutes connected to education. Another newcomer has said, "We are part of this community, and so we are going to use those facilities and institutes, so we need to learn about those things very quickly." So while the news story for newcomer youth working on educational transitions is quite positive, what is clear from our data is that there is an informational barrier when it comes to what services and pathways are available to adult newcomers who want their previous certifications recognized. Settlement groups have indicated there are holes in service providing for adult newcomers wishing to further their education that need to be addressed. The quotes from the newcomers and volunteers speak to this challenge. You can take a minute to read these quotes on the slide. So, as we will explore in the following slide, attending part-time or full-time college or university in order for newcomers to work in their previous employment field is not an accessible pathway for most. So some of the other barriers faced by adult refugees who do choose to go back to school include the time, the financial burden, especially for those who have children, childcare, and the proximity to school. While extended timelines worked for newcomer youth to achieve their educational goals, it is actually a barrier for adults because the time it takes to go back to school takes away from supporting their family financially and caring for their children. As one newcomer says, "I have to go to school and get certificate, and I have children, and I have family, and I cannot do that. How can I find work?" So many newcomers do not choose the pathway of recertifying because it is inaccessible to them. Among both youth and adults, English as an additional language support varied greatly among newcomers. Some newcomers cited helpful strategies to their EAL experience, such as summer classes designed to help with summer school courses. Almost all students indicated more EAL classes are necessary to assist them in obtaining their educational goals, with some indicating their lower language level is holding them back from going to school. Providing access to English as an additional language class has been a huge challenge for volunteer groups to address given the lack of programming in some rural areas, and it has become a key policy issue for many of these groups. While we have not got a chance to explore in detail how or whether post-secondary institutions accommodate newcomers who are English language learners, some volunteers suggest that more could be done by these institutes to assist newcomers, as indicated in one of the quotes on the screen. This is something we hope to explore further as we continue our research. Both groups involved in the study spoke about how volunteering and becoming engaged with the Canadian community are valuable for the newcomers because it helps with practicing EAL, learning about the Canadian culture, and providing them with Canadian experiences to assist with job preparation and applying to post-secondary programs. Students also indicated that their part-time jobs contribute to their education transitions as they provide opportunities to get more involved in the community, increase their language fluency, and help pay for post-secondary education. So in conclusion, when it comes to the educational transitions of community-sponsored refugee youth, there is a good news story that comes out of rural Nova Scotia as they have been quite successful in working on and obtaining their educational goals. For example, in 2 counties that received high school-aged newcomers, all newcomers graduated from high school and the majority went to post-secondary. A number of newcomer youth who we interviewed for this project are at the point of completing or nearly completing their post-secondary education. The quote by the newcomer youth highlighted speaks to the determination and hard work in their educational pursuits. As they put it, "Yeah, it was really challenging. It was hard, but I know that I had the goal that I was going to graduate high school and go to university, so I got to just work." For newcomer adults with previous education who are trying to recertify their credentials, the barriers have proved to be a lot more challenging to overcome. So based on our research and the valuable insights provided by all participants, some of the recommendations to assist with educational and economic transitions of newcomers include more EAL programming available in rural areas, more accessible language level requirements and EAL supports for post-secondary schooling, volunteerism and community involvement being integrated into the resettlement process, and more accessible pathway being provided to get prior credentials tested and recognized. So thank you so much for listening to a presentation today that I've presented on behalf of myself and Dr. Norine Verberg. We'd just like to take a moment to acknowledge our community partners, as well as St. FX University and the organizations who provided us with the grants to work on this project.